In this third dialogue, Trina Paulus describes a software tactic she used in her Discourse study in Chapter 9, and I interpret her thinking in Five-Level QDA terms. In other words, as examples of the way Five-Level QDA is intended to describe the unconscious thinking of an expert researcher. The tactic in question is predefining quotations before coding them, or using them in other ways in the analysis. We discuss some of the reasons why a researcher would predefine quotations, and I interpret Trina's thinking in terms of the Five-Level QDA principles. One tactic we were going to discuss was the predefining of data units. You were interested in this because you really liked doing it, or you were surprised you did it? Or?
Well, so I think the reason that I still tend to do this is not a valid reason any longer. So I think because I've never been quite sure about how the query tool decides whether or not a quotation is coded. How do I say this? What was happening when I was collaborating before I started predefining the units is that I would maybe code the first sentence and a half. My collaborator would code the second half of the first, the second sentence and the third sentence. So we had overlapping quotations that had codes attached to them. And when I was then trying to decide whether or not we agreed or not, it was really hard for me to figure that out, because if we would query it or do a co-occurrence or try to retrieve, it didn't seem like Atlas was being consistent in how it was deciding whether or not quotations were overlapped and coded, and it was really hard for me to figure that out. So it just seemed easier, and since I've been doing it this way ever since, it seemed easier just to have a whole unit of analysis tagged, and then we would both code separately, divide it up, create 2 project files. We would attach codes to the same, and then when I merged them, it seemed much clearer whether or not we had attached our codes to the same quotes.
Here, I would like to interject an interpretation of Trina's thinking as an example of how an experienced researcher unconsciously approaches this analytic task of comparing overlapping quotations. Here is an analytic planning worksheet, which, as you know by now, is a way of describing experts' unconscious thinking, and which I've created retrospectively to represent Trina's hypothetical analytic task of comparing the team members' coding for consistency. In the dialogue you've just heard, Trina doesn't use the Five-Level QDA terminology or an analytic planning worksheet because these did not exist when she did this study. You can download the analytic planning worksheet from the video page if that's easier to follow. So, Trina's concern with exactly how the query tool works when finding overlapping quotations is an example of working at the level of features of the program, in this case the query tool feature. And as you know from the book, we refer to a feature as a combination of a component and one or more actions. The query tool feature is a sophisticated combination of components and actions that can take some experimentation to be sure exactly how it is working and what its results represent. And this dialogue video with Trina is not at all concerned with how the query tool actually works and whether or not Trina would have been better off knowing more about how it did work for the purpose she had in mind. Our point is that Trina had uncertainty and concern about this feature of the program, and that led her to address her analytic task of comparing her coding with her co-researcher's coding by translating the task to a component of the software, in this case free quotations, and to use a constructed tool. First to create a set of free quotations, then have each researcher code this same set of free quotations separately, then merge the ATLAS.ti projects, and then compare the coding of each quotation. Trina found this constructed tool understandable, safe, and reliable. Her thinking was Five-Level QDA thinking, particularly because it also included the important Five-Level QDA consideration, what do we anticipate will come next? Trina knew that she wanted to count the quotations coded a certain way, and so this was an additional reason to choose this constructed tool, because it would facilitate that later analytic task of accurately counting coded quotations. Trina now continues by talking about this second reason for creating predefined quotations.
And it also made a difference when we were trying to count up the number of quotations, because if we're all creating our own quotations all over the place, it's hard to do frequency counts. And I think maybe that was another thing that came out, is that really we were coding the same meaning unit, but it shows up as two different quotations when really it's not. So all of those sort of conundrums about merging projects and trying to do frequency counts and trying to query resulted in me just predefining the quotations and attaching the quotes to them, and then we could merge much more easily.
In the final section of dialogue, Trina reflects on a disadvantage of creating predetermined quotations, which is that they can be rather long in order to capture entire units of meaning, but then if there are multiple codes applied by different researchers to the same long quotation, each code doesn't necessarily apply to all parts of the long quotation, which can be inefficient to interpret or even confusing when later retrieving the quotations for any one code. However, Trina goes on to explain that the obvious solution of predetermining much smaller quotations, so that each has only maybe one or two codes, may solve that technical or tactical issue, but these smaller quotations would not really serve the purposes of discourse analysis, which require all the discursive moves to be reflected in the same meaning unit. And so she doesn't want to let the tactics, the way the software works, drive the strategy or the translation process. This again is Five-Level QDA thinking, even though Trina is not using that terminology, because it privileges the strategies in decision-making. Then finally, I suggest one Five-Level QDA solution, meaning a solution that's driven by the strategy requirement to have larger quotations for discourse analysis, and I extend Trina's constructed tool in the analytic planning worksheet in order to accomplish the analytic task.
But the disadvantages are very true, which is that the long units end up being very difficult to interpret because you have all of your codes attached to every quotation.
So are you tempted to make smaller units?
Yeah, sometimes, because of it often being a turn-by-turn analysis of conversations or blog posts and comments. I usually want to leave those intact rather than me deciding as the project manager where the meaning lies. But that would be one solution, is for me to just do sentence by sentence or making the units much smaller. But again, right, it can confound what you're really saying if you end up having 5 sentences, all of which are coded the same thing, because really it's just one meaning unit. So I find this part really interesting and really challenging with the software sometimes.
Sometimes I apply a code to a larger segment of text for the reasons you've been saying, and then in the comment I say this code only applies to the last sentence.
Yeah, that would, yeah.
And then when I'm reading the printout, it's very, very clear, but then I do get all the other advantages, especially in a team situation.